"Get out of my store, old man." The young man said it loud enough for everyone in the hardware store to hear. Earl Bennett stood beside the counter with one hand resting on the worn wooden handle of his cane. He was 79. He wore an old brown field jacket, faded at the elbows, and a gray work shirt buttoned to the neck. He did not answer. The store was quiet that Saturday morning. A ceiling fan turned slow above the aisles. Somewhere near the back, a compressor kicked on with a low hum. The young boss, Ryan Cole, waited for a reaction. He was 32, clean-cut, wearing a blue polo with the store logo stitched over his chest. His father had owned the place for years. Ryan had taken over 6 months earlier. He looked at Earl the way a man looks at something he has already decided does not belong. "Did you hear me?" Earl lifted his eyes. "Yes." His voice was flat. Ryan folded his arms. "Then leave." Earl glanced toward the counter. Beside the register sat a small cardboard box containing replacement bolts. He had come in for 4 of them. "I need those." Ryan gave a short laugh. "You need a lot of things, apparently." A woman near the paint aisle stopped comparing 2 cans and looked over. Earl reached into his jacket. His fingers were thick and rough. The nails were short. There were pale lines across his knuckles that had been there for decades. He pulled out a small leather wallet. Not a driver's license. A military ID. Ryan looked at it for half a second. Then he shook his head. "I don't care." Earl slowly put it away. There was no argument. No raised voice. That seemed to irritate Ryan more. "Look, this isn't a veteran center. It's a business. If you're here to complain about prices or ask somebody for a handout, you're wasting my time." Earl looked at him. "I didn't ask for anything." Ryan stepped closer. "Then why are you still standing here?" The old man's hand moved from the cane to the edge of the counter. For a moment, the store seemed smaller. He had spent enough years around men who shouted because they were afraid of being ignored. He knew better than to answer every challenge. So he simply said, "I paid for the bolts." Ryan looked down. The 4 bolts were still sitting in Earl's palm. "I'll refund you." "I don't want a refund." "You don't have a choice." Earl's jaw tightened once. Then relaxed. He placed the bolts on the counter. The cashier, a young woman named Megan, watched him carefully. She noticed something Ryan had missed. Earl's jacket had a small stitched patch above the left pocket. Most of it was faded. Only 3 letters could still be read. Earl turned toward the door. The bell above it gave a soft metallic ring. Outside, a sheriff's cruiser was parked across the street. Earl stopped. Not because he was afraid. Because the cruiser had just pulled into the parking lot. Ryan smiled. "Good. Maybe you can explain to the sheriff why you're bothering my customers." Earl said nothing. The sheriff's door opened. A tall man in uniform stepped out, adjusted his hat, and looked through the store window. His eyes settled on Earl. Then on the old patch above Earl's pocket. The sheriff stopped walking. For the first time that morning, the young boss's smile disappeared. The sheriff stepped through the door and let it close behind him. He did not hurry. Sheriff Daniel Mercer was a broad man in his late 50s, with a gray mustache and a uniform that had seen better days. His boots were dusty around the edges. His hat sat low over his eyes. He looked at Earl first. "Morning, Earl." Earl gave him a small nod. "Sheriff." Ryan Cole shifted behind the counter. "You know him?" Mercer looked at Ryan. "Everybody knows Earl." Ryan gave a short laugh. "Well, I don't. That much is clear." The cashier lowered her eyes to hide a smile. Ryan's face hardened. "Sheriff, this is private property. I asked him to leave. Mercer glanced at Earl's cane, then at the 4 bolts on the counter. He buy something? Yes. Did he pay? Yes. Then what's the problem? Ryan spread his hands. He's been standing here. He doesn't answer questions. He looks suspicious. Earl said nothing. He reached into his jacket and took out his wallet again. Mercer recognized it. Old brown leather. Worn corners. A crease down the middle. You still carry that thing? The sheriff asked. Always have. Ryan looked between them. What is this? Some kind of veterans club? Earl slipped the wallet back into his pocket. No, Mercer watched him for a moment. Earl had learned long ago not to argue with a man who had already made up his mind. On a bad day, arguing only gave the other man more room to make a fool of himself. Ryan leaned across the counter. Look, old man. I run this store. You don't like the way I do business, there's the door. Earl looked at the door. Then at Ryan. I was already leaving. Ryan smirked. Good. Earl took one step. Ryan added, and don't come back. Earl stopped. Not because of the words. Because of the way Ryan said them. Like he owned more than the store. Like he owned the right to decide who deserved respect. Earl turned slowly. My money spends the same as anybody else's. Ryan's smile faded. You heard me. Mercer stepped between them. That'll do. Ryan looked at the sheriff. This is my business. And this is my county. The store went quiet. Mercer looked at Earl again. Earl, you want me to handle this? Earl shook his head. No need. The sheriff studied him. You sure? I've been called worse. Ryan laughed under his breath. What, by people who knew you? Earl's eyes settled on him. For the first time, something changed. Not anger. Something colder. Recognition. He had heard that kind of voice before. Young. Certain. Loud enough to cover what it did not know. He reached into his jacket once more. This time he pulled out an old military identification card. The plastic was scratched. The photograph was faded. The name was still clear. Earl Bennett. Below it was a service number and a small insignia Ryan did not recognize. Mercer saw it. His jaw tightened. Where did you get that? Earl looked at the card. I earned it. The sheriff stared at the insignia. Then he looked at Earl's face. He had seen that mark before. Not in a museum. Not in a history book. On a photograph hanging inside the county veterans hall. Mercer took one slow breath. Earl, he said quietly, how long were you planning on keeping that to yourself? Earl put the card away. As long as I could. Ryan frowned. What does that mean? Mercer looked at him. It means you should have asked who he was before you told him to get out. Outside, another vehicle pulled into the parking lot. Mercer glanced through the window. Then back at Earl. His hand moved toward his radio. This time, Earl did not stop him. You are not calling anybody over this. Ryan Cole stepped around the counter and pointed at Sheriff Mercer's radio. His voice had lost some of its confidence, but not the attitude. Mercer looked at the finger. Then at Ryan. Put your hand down. Ryan did. Slowly. Earl remained beside the door. His cane rested against his leg. One hand held the paper bag with the 4 bolts inside. The other was tucked into his jacket pocket. He looked like a man waiting for a bus. Nothing more. Ryan shook his head. This is ridiculous. He comes in here acting like he owns the place, refuses to leave, and now you are making this into some kind of military ceremony. Earl looked at him. It is not a ceremony. Then what is it? Nothing. That answer stopped Ryan for half a second. Then his pride took over again. You know what? I am done with this. He reached under the counter and pulled out his phone. I am calling my attorney. Mercer nodded. Go ahead. Ryan punched in a number. Earl watched him without moving. The cashier, Megan, quietly placed the bolts back into the small cardboard box. She had worked there for 3 years. She had known Ryan's father. He had never spoken to customers the way his son did. Ryan turned away and lowered his voice. Dad would never have let this happen. Mercer heard him. Your father would have asked a few questions first. Ryan turned. What does that mean? Mercer did not answer. Instead, he looked at Earl. Earl, you want to sit down? No, you have been standing a while. I have stood longer. Mercer gave a small nod. There was something in the way Earl said it. No pride. No complaint. Just fact. Ryan ended the call. My attorney says you cannot force me to let someone stay in my store. Mercer looked at him. I am not forcing you to let him stay. Good. I am asking you to stop insulting him. Ryan scoffed. Or what? Mercer's eyes hardened. Or you will find out how quickly a bad morning can become a bad week. Ryan stared at him. Then he looked at Earl. You hear that? Your friend is threatening me. Earl shook his head. He is warning you. The words were quiet. Ryan's face reddened. He stepped toward Earl. You think you are better than me? Earl did not move. No, then why do you keep looking at me like that? Like what? Like you know something. Earl's fingers tightened around the paper bag. I know what I know. Ryan laughed. That is exactly the problem with old men. You think age makes you important. Earl looked down at his hands. The skin was thin now. The knuckles were still wide. A pale scar crossed the back of his right hand. Mercer noticed it. He had seen that scar before. Not on Earl. In a photograph. A photograph hanging in the county sheriff's office. Mercer reached for his radio again. This time, Earl looked at him. Sheriff. Mercer stopped. Earl's voice stayed low. Do not make a fuss. Mercer studied him. Then he said, I am not making a fuss. He pressed the radio button. Dispatch, I need a records check on an old service identification. Ryan frowned. Why? Mercer looked at the worn jacket. Then at Earl. Because I think we have been standing in this store with a man whose name should mean something. Earl closed his eyes for one brief second. The sheriff gave dispatch the name. Earl Bennett. There was a pause. Then static. Then a voice came back. Sheriff, repeat the name. Mercer did. The reply came faster this time. Stand by. Ryan's smile disappeared. Earl simply looked toward the front window. He had heard that tone before. Not from a radio. From men who suddenly realized they were speaking to someone they should have recognized. Stand by. Ryan said. What does that mean? The sheriff kept the radio in his hand. He did not answer. Static filled the little speaker for another second. Then the dispatcher came back. Sheriff, I have a restricted file attached to that name. I need confirmation. Mercer looked at Earl. The old man gave one slow shake of his head. No need. Ryan stared at him. What are you hiding? Earl reached into his jacket and pulled out the old military card again. He laid it flat on the counter. The photograph showed a much younger man with a straight back and dark hair. Beneath the photograph was the same name. Earl Bennett. Megan stepped closer without meaning to. "That is you?" she asked. Earl nodded. "A long time ago." Ryan picked up the card before anyone could stop him. "This thing is ancient." He turned it over. There was a small unit insignia stamped into the back. Ryan frowned at it. "What is this supposed to be?" Earl took the card from his hand. "Put it down next time." His voice was still calm. That was what made Ryan hesitate. Earl did not sound angry. He sounded like a man correcting a child who had crossed a line. Sheriff Mercer noticed the change too. "Ryan," he said, "you should listen to him." Ryan gave a nervous laugh. "Why? Because he has an old military card?" Mercer looked at the insignia. "No. Because I know that mark." Earl slipped the card back into his wallet. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Megan noticed the leather bag hanging from Earl's shoulder. It was small, brown, and badly worn. A brass clasp held it shut. "What is in there?" she asked. Earl looked down. "Tools." Ryan laughed again. "Of course." Earl ignored him. He opened the bag. Inside were a folding screwdriver, a small wrench, a roll of electrical tape, and 3 narrow metal picks. Nothing fancy. Nothing new. Every piece had been used hard and cared for carefully. Mercer looked at the tools. "You still carry those?" Earl nodded. "They still work." Ryan shook his head. "This is getting ridiculous." He reached for the store phone. "I am calling the owner." Mercer looked at him. "Your father?" "Yes." Ryan punched the number. The phone rang once. Twice. Then someone answered. Ryan spoke quickly. "Dad, there is an old man here causing trouble. Sheriff Mercer is making a big deal out of it." He paused. His expression changed. "Earl Bennett." Silence. Ryan looked at Earl. "Dad?" He listened. His face slowly lost its color. "What?" Earl did not look at him. He was watching the small brass clasp on his tool bag. The sheriff stepped closer. "What did he say?" Ryan lowered the phone. "He asked if Earl still has the brown tool bag." Mercer's eyes moved to it. Earl closed the clasp. "Your father remembers." Ryan swallowed. He said I am not to touch that man." The store went quiet. Earl picked up his paper bag with the 4 bolts. "Good advice." Ryan looked at the old jacket again. Then at the scarred hands. Then at the little bag that had apparently survived longer than he had been alive. Something had changed. He still did not know the whole story. But he finally understood one thing. Earl Bennett had not walked into the store looking for respect. He had simply expected the basic kind every man ought to give another man. Sheriff Mercer lowered his radio. "Earl," he said, "your past is catching up with you." Earl gave him a tired look. "It never really left." "What happened?" Ryan asked. His father was still on the phone. Before he could answer, a loud crack came from the back of the store. The lights went out. The compressor stopped. The register screen went black. Somewhere near the rear wall, a sharp hiss followed. Megan stepped away from the counter. "What was that?" Ryan grabbed his phone and turned on the flashlight. The beam shook across the aisles. Probably the breaker. Earl was already moving. He set his paper bag on the counter and walked toward the back. Ryan called after him. "Where are you going?" Earl did not answer. At the rear of the store, a propane heater had been running near the service door. A hose had come loose from the fitting. Earl stopped several feet away. He smelled the gas. His face changed. "Everybody outside." Ryan frowned. It's just a heater. Earl turned. Outside. Now. There was something in his voice that made Megan move first. Sheriff Mercer followed her. Ryan stayed where he was. You don't own this place. Earl looked at him. No. But I know what gas smells like. Ryan opened his mouth. Earl raised one hand. Do not touch that switch. Ryan froze with his fingers inches from the wall. Earl pointed toward the front door. Move. The young boss finally stepped back. Earl took the old leather tool bag from his shoulder. He opened it and removed a small wrench. Mercer watched from the doorway. Earl, you sure? Earl nodded. Keep them outside. He crouched near the heater. His old knees made the movement slow, but his hands were steady. He checked the valve first. Then the hose. Then the fitting. He did not rush. He tightened the connection a little at a time. The hiss weakened. Stopped. Earl waited. He watched the gauge. Then he shut the main valve. Only after that did he stand. Outside, Ryan was pale. How did you know? Earl looked at him. You smell it. Ryan shook his head. I mean, how did you know what to do? Earl closed the tool bag. Same way I knew not to touch that switch. Mercer looked at him. Where'd you learn that? Earl gave him a tired half-smile. Some lessons come with the uniform. Ryan said nothing. The sheriff stepped back inside after the air cleared. He looked at the heater, then at the old tool bag. You just kept that stuff all these years? Earl nodded. Tools don't care how old you are. Ryan stared at the small wrench in Earl's hand. It was scratched, dark with age, and polished smooth where years of fingers had held it. His father's voice suddenly came through the phone again. Ryan lifted it to his ear. Dad? A pause. Then Ryan looked at Earl. He wants to talk to you. Earl shook his head. Not today. Ryan lowered the phone slowly. The young boss had spent the morning trying to throw an old man out of his store. Now he was standing outside because that same old man had just prevented a gas leak from becoming something much worse. Sheriff Mercer looked at Earl's hands. You still got the touch. Earl put the wrench away. I still pay attention. You're not going to tell me that gas leak was some kind of accident, are you? Ryan said. The store had barely reopened after the danger passed. The lights were back on. The compressor had started again. But nobody was standing where they had been 10 minutes earlier. Megan stayed near the front door. Sheriff Mercer stood beside Earl. Ryan remained behind the counter, phone still in his hand. What are you talking about? Earl asked. Ryan pointed toward the back room. You just happen to know exactly what to do. Earl looked at him. I smelled gas. Convenient. Mercer stepped forward. Careful. Ryan ignored him. You walk in here with an old military card, an old tool bag, and suddenly you save the day. What am I supposed to think? Earl picked up the paper bag with the 4 bolts. Think whatever you want. Ryan's face tightened. That's not good enough. He reached under the counter and pulled out a clipboard. This store has cameras. Everything is recorded. Earl looked at the ceiling. Then watched the footage. Ryan flipped through the pages. You were standing by that heater before the power went out. Earl nodded. Yes. So you were back there? Yes. Why? Earl looked at the sheriff. Then back at Ryan. Because I heard the hiss. Ryan shook his head. You expect me to believe that? Earl did not answer. Megan finally spoke. I heard it too. Ryan turned on her. You stay out of this. She took one step back. Sheriff Mercer looked at Ryan. That's enough. Ryan slammed the clipboard onto the counter. No. I want answers. He pointed at Earl. Who are you? Earl stood still. The old field jacket hung loose around his shoulders. The faded patch above his pocket was barely visible beneath the store's fluorescent lights. Earl Bennett. That's not an answer. It's my name. Ryan stared at him. What did you do in the army? Earl's eyes moved to the old tool bag. I fixed things. Ryan laughed. That's it? Mostly. You were a mechanic. Earl nodded. Among other things. Ryan stepped around the counter. Then prove it. Mercer frowned. Ryan. No, Sheriff. If he's some kind of hero, let him prove it. Earl looked at him for a long second. Then a sharp electrical pop came from the back room. The lights flickered. The compressor groaned and stopped. Earl turned immediately. He walked toward the rear without a word. Ryan followed. Mercer came behind them. Earl opened the service panel. 3 breakers were still up. One was hot to the touch. He did not flip it. He crouched and looked at the wiring. Who installed this? Ryan asked. Doesn't matter. Earl pointed. That wire is feeding the wrong circuit. Ryan stared at it. How can you tell? Earl touched the insulation with 2 fingers. Heat. He pulled out the small screwdriver from his leather bag. This isn't a store problem. It's an installation problem. He removed the cover. Inside, the wiring was a mess of old connections and newer additions. Earl traced one line with his finger. Someone added this freezer last year. Ryan nodded slowly. My father did. Earl pointed again. He tied it into the lighting circuit. Ryan's face changed. Earl tightened one loose terminal and showed him the blackened screw. This was about to fail. Mercer looked at the damaged connection. How close? Earl closed the panel. Close enough. Ryan stared at the old man. The sarcasm was gone. He looked at the scarred screwdriver, then at Earl's hands. How did you know? Earl put the tool away. I spent years finding problems before they killed somebody. Ryan had no answer. For the first time, the young boss looked less angry than ashamed. And Earl still had not raised his voice once. Ryan, step away from that panel. Sheriff Mercer's voice was firm now. Ryan did not move. He stared at the burned terminal Earl had just pointed out. His face had gone pale. My father installed that. Earl closed his tool bag. Then your father made a mistake. Ryan looked at him. You're saying my father wired this place wrong. I'm saying the connection was wrong. Megan stood a few feet away, still holding her phone. She had heard enough. Ryan, you need to see something. He turned. What? She held up the screen. The camera. Ryan walked over. The footage showed Earl entering the store that morning. It showed him paying for the bolts. It showed Ryan stepping around the counter and ordering him out. Then it showed Earl walking toward the back. He stopped near the service door. He stood there for several seconds. Then his head turned. The camera caught him looking toward the heater. Ryan watched the old man move closer. No tampering. No touching. Just listening. Then Earl turned around and told everyone to leave. Ryan watched the screen in silence. Megan lowered the phone. He didn't cause anything. No, Mercer said. He stopped it. Ryan rubbed his forehead. For the first time that morning, there was nobody left to blame. His father had warned him. The sheriff had warned him. The cameras had shown him. And Earl had said almost nothing. Ryan looked across the store. Earl was standing beside the counter, holding his old paper bag. The same man Ryan had called Old Man. The same man he had tried to throw out. The same man who had just protected his customers from a dangerous gas leak and caught a serious electrical problem before it became worse. Ryan swallowed. "Why didn't you tell me?" Earl looked at him. "Tell you what? Who you were?" Earl gave a small shrug. "You never asked." Ryan looked down. The answer hit harder than an argument would have. Sheriff Mercer stepped closer. "Ryan, you owe him an apology." Ryan looked at Earl. His mouth opened. Nothing came out. Megan spoke quietly. "You should." Ryan finally nodded. He walked around the counter. Stopped in front of Earl. "I was wrong." Earl said nothing. "I treated you badly." Still nothing. Ryan looked at the old jacket. "I shouldn't have called you that." Earl's eyes stayed on him. "Which part?" Ryan lowered his head. "Old man." Earl nodded once. "Age isn't an insult." Ryan looked up. "No, it is something you earn." The store went quiet. Sheriff Mercer looked away. Megan wiped at one eye with the back of her hand. Then the radio on Mercer's shoulder crackled. "Sheriff, we have confirmation." Mercer reached for it. "Go ahead." The dispatcher spoke slowly. "Earl Bennett. Former Army. Special Operations Support. Multiple commendations. Restricted service record." Ryan looked at Earl. Mercer listened. Then his expression changed. "Anything else?" There was a pause. "Yes, Sheriff." The voice on the radio became quieter. "There's a note attached to the file." Mercer frowned. "What note?" Another pause. "Do not question his service." Nobody spoke. Earl looked toward the front window. Outside, the sheriff's cruiser sat in the morning sun. He picked up his paper bag. "Can I go now?" Mercer nodded. "Yes, Earl." Ryan stepped aside. This time, he held the door open. Earl walked past him without a word. Ryan watched him leave. The bell above the door gave one soft ring. And the young boss stood there, finally understanding that the man he had tried to humiliate had never needed his approval in the first place. "Earl, wait." Ryan stood in the doorway, one hand still holding it open. Earl stopped on the sidewalk. The morning sun caught the worn edge of his field jacket. His paper bag hung from his left hand. The old leather tool bag rested against his hip. He turned. Ryan stepped outside. "I need to say something." Earl waited. Ryan looked uncomfortable. For a young man used to giving orders, he suddenly seemed unsure what to do with his hands. "I was wrong," he said. Earl nodded once. "I heard you. I mean it. I know." Ryan looked down at the pavement. "I treated you like you didn't belong in my store." Earl looked at the sign above the door. "It's your store." "That doesn't make it right." Earl said nothing. Sheriff Mercer came outside and stood beside them. Ryan took a breath. "My father told me something before he hung up." Earl looked at him. "He said you helped him when he was young." Earl's eyes narrowed slightly. "Your father?" Ryan nodded. "He said there was a winter storm. The pipes froze. The store almost lost everything." Earl gave a small shrug. "Your father was 22. Ryan looked surprised. "You remember?" "I remember people." Mercer smiled faintly. Ryan continued. "He said you came in at 3 in the morning and fixed the main line." Earl looked toward the road. "Your father paid me. He said you wouldn't take the money." Earl's mouth moved into the smallest smile. He bought me breakfast. Ryan looked at him. That was enough. Best breakfast in town. Mercer let out a quiet laugh. Ryan looked back at the store. I didn't know. Earl nodded. That's why you should ask before you judge. The words were simple. No lecture. No anger. Ryan took them in. A pickup pulled into the parking lot. An older man stepped out. Then another. They had seen the sheriff's cruiser. One of them recognized Earl. Earl Bennett. Earl turned. The man walked over slowly. He was in his 70s, wearing a faded baseball cap. I haven't seen you in years. Earl shook his hand. Been a while. The man looked at Ryan. Then at the sheriff. What happened? Mercer answered. Nothing that needs a report. The older man smiled. That's Earl. Ryan watched the two men talk. There was no boasting. No story about medals. No mention of ranks. Earl asked about the man's wife. Asked about his grandson. Asked whether the old pickup was still running. The conversation sounded like two neighbors catching up. Nothing more. Then the sheriff's radio crackled again. Sheriff, command wants confirmation on Bennett. Mercer pressed the button. Confirmed. Any assistance needed? Mercer looked at Earl. Earl shook his head. No assistance. Mercer answered. Negative. The radio went quiet. Ryan stared at Earl. You could have had half the county here. Earl adjusted the strap of his tool bag. Didn't need them. Why not? Earl looked at him. Because it was just a store. Ryan gave a quiet laugh. I suppose that's how you see everything. Earl nodded. Most problems get smaller when you don't make them bigger. The sheriff smiled. That sounds like something you learned in the service. Earl looked down at his hands. Maybe. Ryan stepped forward. I'd like you to come back. Earl raised an eyebrow. For what? Anything you need. Earl shook his head. I just need 4 bolts. Ryan looked toward the counter. They're yours. Earl held up the paper bag. I already paid. Ryan smiled. Then they're still yours. Earl nodded. Fair enough. He started walking toward his old pickup. Ryan watched him go. Then he called after him. Earl. The old man turned. Thank you. Earl stood there for a moment. Then he gave the young boss a small nod. Take care of your people. Ryan nodded. I will. Earl got into the truck. The engine started on the second try. He backed out slowly and drove down the road. Sheriff Mercer stood beside Ryan. You know what you just got? Ryan watched the truck disappear around the corner. A lesson? Mercer nodded. Keep it. Ryan looked at the empty road. I will. Inside the store, the old 4 bolts were no longer important. The lesson was. Earl Bennett had walked in asking for nothing but a few dollars worth of hardware. He left with his dignity exactly where he had kept it all along. Not in his medals. Not in his old identification card. Not in the story of what he had done. It was in the way he carried himself. Quiet. Straight-backed. And without needing anybody to tell him who he was. Take care of your people. Those were the last words Ryan heard from Earl Bennett that morning. Not a speech. Not a warning. Just a simple sentence from an old soldier who had spent a lifetime learning that men were measured by what they did when nobody was watching. Earl's pickup disappeared down the county road. Sheriff Mercer stayed beside Ryan for another minute. Then he looked at the store. You going to be all right? Ryan nodded. I think so. Mercer put his hat back on. Good. He walked toward his cruiser. Ryan stood there alone. The morning had changed. The same building was there. Same shelves. Same counter. Same bell above the door. But Ryan looked at it differently. He thought about how quickly he had judged Earl. The old jacket. The cane. The worn hands. The quiet voice. He had mistaken age for weakness. He had mistaken silence for ignorance. And he had mistaken his position behind a counter for authority. Inside, Megan was putting the hardware back in order. Ryan walked in. Hey. She looked up. Yeah. I'm changing the policy. What policy? If somebody comes in here, we treat them with respect. Megan smiled. That's not a bad policy. Ryan looked toward the door. No. It isn't. Later that afternoon, Ryan's father called again. This time Ryan answered without complaining. His father asked whether Earl had left. Yeah. Did you apologize? Ryan looked through the front window. Yes. And? Ryan thought for a moment. He told me to take care of my people. There was silence on the other end. Then his father said, "That's Earl." Ryan leaned against the counter. Dad, what did he actually do? His father was quiet for several seconds. You don't need the whole story. I want to know. You'll understand when you're older. Ryan looked at the gray hair reflected in the front window of the store. For once, he did not argue. That evening, Sheriff Mercer stopped by the county veterans hall. A photograph hung on the wall near the entrance. Old black and white print. A group of young soldiers standing beside a transport truck. Most were barely more than boys. In the second row stood Earl Bennett. Young. Straight-backed. His uniform was dusty. His eyes were fixed on the camera. Under the photograph was a small brass plate. No long story. No list of achievements. Just a name. Earl Bennett. Mercer stood there for a moment. Then he removed his hat. That was all. Across town, Earl sat at his kitchen table. His old leather tool bag rested beside the chair. His military wallet lay on the table. He opened it. Inside was the faded service card. He looked at it for a few seconds. Then closed the wallet. He did not need the card to remember who he was. He had carried that answer for most of his life. Not because people praised him. Not because strangers knew his name. And not because a sheriff had walked into a store at the right time. He knew because he had served. He had done his job. He had stood beside men who depended on him. And when his time in uniform ended, he kept the same rule. Do what needs doing. Protect the people beside you. Keep your word. Earl picked up the leather bag and placed it beside the door for the morning. Then he turned off the kitchen light. Some men leave the service. They never leave the code. And sometimes the quietest man in the room is the one who has already proved everything that matters. Respect is not something an old soldier has to demand. It is something his life has already earned. And honor, once carried honestly, does not grow old.